the bridge of life and death. The wind blew gently between the trees of the monastery. It was autumn, and the leaves fell in a slow sway, as if floating between two worlds, in no rush to touch the ground. By the lotus pond, a young monk approached his master, an elderly man with a serene face, observing the reflection of the moon in the water. "Master," the disciple asked, "what happens after death?" The master did not look away from the pond. For a moment, only the murmur of the water was heard. Finally, he replied calmly, "I don't know." The young monk frowned. "But you are a Zen master." The elderly man smiled faintly and said, "Yes, but not a dead master." The disciple fell silent. He hadn't expected that response. He felt the air around him growing denser, as if something invisible weighed on his chest. The master slowly stood and pointed to an old wooden bridge crossing the nearby stream. "Come, walk with me." The young monk obeyed without question. The bridge creaked beneath their feet. The full moon illuminated the stream, flowing relentlessly beneath them. The master stopped halfway across the bridge and said, "Here we are, between two shores. One is life, the other is death. What do you see?" The disciple looked to both sides. Then he focused on the water flowing beneath them. "I see the river moving. It is never the same." The master nodded. "That's right. Now tell me, where does the water begin and where does it end?" The disciple opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The wind blew again, lifting a swirl of golden leaves. The young monk watched the river intently. His thoughts tried to find an answer, but each idea that arose dissolved like foam in the current. "I don't know, master," he finally admitted. "The water flows without a clear beginning or end." The master smiled softly. "So too is life and death. We believe there is a point where we begin and another where we end, but in reality we are just part of a constant flow." The disciple furrowed his brow, trying to grasp his words. "But if life and death are like this river, why do we fear death?" The elderly man extended a hand, letting the breeze play with the folds of his robe. "Because we believe we are the bridge and not the water." The disciple lowered his gaze, feeling the wood beneath his feet. "And what if we stop clinging to the bridge?" The master nodded with approval. "Then we understand that we were never prisoners of one shore or the other." The moon reflected on the water trembled with the movement of the river. The young monk felt something within him also move, like a leaf detaching from a branch, floating without resistance. The master began walking toward the other shore. "Come, let's keep walking." The disciple followed in silence, feeling that each step was both a going and a returning. Each step on the bridge resonated in the night air. The young monk felt that with each creak of the wood, something within him was detaching, as if his understanding of life and death was dissolving, leaving only the current of what is. When they reached the other side, the master stopped and pointed to a moss-covered rock by the river. "Look at that rock," he said. "It has been here for a long time, watching the water pass, feeling the seasons change. Do you think it fears the current?" The disciple shook his head. "No, master. The rock simply is." The elderly man nodded. "So should we be. Death is not an enemy nor an abyss. It is simply part of the flow, like the day giving way to the night, like the river following its course." The disciple looked at the rock, then at the water, then at his master. Something inside him expanded, as if an invisible weight had dissipated. Then, he whispered, "There is nothing to fear." The master smiled, and for a moment, the wind stopped blowing, as if the universe itself had held its breath. The young monk closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the river. In that instant, he understood he was not the bridge, nor the rock, nor even the water. He was the flow itself. Silence enveloped the scene, But within the young monk, something vibrated intensely. He opened his eyes and looked at the river with new clarity. It had always been there, flowing without resistance, without questioning its fate. The master sat on the moss-covered rock and patted its surface gently, inviting his disciple to do the same. "Sit down, listen," he said softly. The monk obeyed. He remained still, perceiving each sound. The murmur of the water, the whisper of dry leaves moving with the breeze, the beat of his own heart. "Master," he said after a long silence, "if death is just part of the flow, what happens to those we leave behind?" The elderly man closed his eyes for a moment, as if letting the question float in the air before responding. "When a leaf falls into the river, it does not disappear. Continues its journey, becomes part of the water, food for the earth. The same happens with those who leave us. They have not gone, they have only changed form." The monk felt a knot in his chest. "And the pain we feel?" The master opened his eyes and looked at the moon's reflection in the water. "Pain is like a wave. At first, it is strong, it drags us. But if we don't fight it, if we let it pass, it eventually calms down." The disciple nodded slowly. He continued looking at the river, wondering how many leaves, how many memories, how many sighs had become part of its current. And, for the first time, the fear of death seemed to dissolve in the flow of the water. The young monk remained silent, watching as the current carried a golden leaf downstream. In its serene movement, he understood that life did not cling to anything. It simply followed its course. The master slowly stood and pointed to the moon reflected in the water. "Look at the moon in the river. It looks real, but if you try to catch it with your hands, you will only find water." The disciple bowed his head. "So, is life like that reflection?" The elderly man smiled. "Yes and no. It is real as we experience it, but we cannot possess it. If we try to cling to it, we are left with empty hands." The young monk picked up a small stone and dropped it into the water. The reflection of the moon distorted for an instant, but then returned to its serene form. "Death is like that stone," he whispered. "It may alter the surface, but the moon remains." The master watched him with satisfaction. "Now you understand. Life changes form, but its essence does not disappear." The wind blew gently, stirring their robes. The disciple felt how his own being became light, as if something within him had loosened. For the first time in his life, death no longer seemed like an end, but a continuation. The young monk remained seated next to the master, listening to the flow of the water. He no longer felt anxiety, only a stillness that spread within him, like the serene reflection of the moon over the river. After a while, the master broke the silence. "There is a story," he said, "about a man who dreamed he was a butterfly." The disciple looked up. When he woke up, the master continued, "He didn't know if he was a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man." The young monk furrowed his brow. "What does that mean, master?" The elderly man smiled gently. "It means that perhaps life and death are nothing more than two dreams within the same great awakening." The disciple felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked at his own hands, then at the water, then at his master. "So, when we die, do we awaken?" The master did not respond immediately. He simply closed his eyes and breathed deeply. Then, he slowly opened his eyelids and said, "There is only one way to know. But when the time comes, don't worry. The river never stops flowing." The disciple felt that the master's words were not just another teaching, but a truth that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The night breeze whispered through the trees. The bridge, the river, the moon, everything seemed to be part of a single eternal moment. The young monk kept looking at the river, letting his master's words settle within him like leaves softly falling on the current. For a moment, he felt that everything was perfectly clear. There was no separation between life and death, between water and sky, between him and the entire universe. "Master," he whispered, "if death is just a change of form, what sense is there in fearing it?" The elderly man looked at him with a serene expression. "There is no sense in fearing it," he said, "just as there is no sense in fearing the dawn when the night ends." The monk closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He felt the air entering his body, the quiet beat of his heart, the warmth of the earth beneath his feet. When he opened his eyes, he saw the master smiling softly. "You've crossed the bridge," said the elderly man. The disciple blinked. "But I'm still here." The master nodded. "Yes, but you are no longer the same person who asked the question at the beginning of the night." The young monk understood. The bridge was not just made of wood. It was the path he had traveled within himself. And now, on the other side, he saw life and death with new eyes. The water continued to flow beneath the bridge. The moon shone high above, and in the disciple's heart, fear had given way to stillness. The young monk and his master remained in silence, contemplating the river. There was no hurry, no urgency, only the eternal flow of the water and the whisper of the wind among the trees. After a while, the elderly man stood up and began walking back to the monastery. The disciple followed him, feeling with each step the lightness of someone who has left behind a heavy burden. When they reached the temple's threshold, the master stopped and, without turning, said, "Remember, life and death are like day and night. They do not oppose each other. They only follow one another. Do not fear the sunset, because there will always be a new dawn." The young monk bowed his head in respect. "Thank you, master." The elderly man smiled and entered the temple's shadow. The disciple remained outside for a moment longer, gazing at the moon one last time. The reflection in the river trembled softly with the breeze, but the moon remained intact in the sky. He smiled serenely, and with a light heart, he crossed the threshold. The bridge had been crossed.